This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We're going to get a top guest on the show at about 10:30. Before that, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this. But bear with me. I will, of course, bring you any details about the escaped prisoner. I like absconded. I prefer the word absconded. The absconded prisoner, if and when they emerge. The whole of Richmond Park is closed. I've got no idea what that involves. But it's big. I don't know if you're familiar with Richmond Park. You say park and you think of somewhere at the bottom of your road that's got swings and a slide. And, you know, if you're very lucky, perhaps a paddling pool. But Richmond Park is I think that it was essentially a hunting estate for one of the Henrys. And, I mean, therefore you can imagine how big it is. You can gallop around it on horses. Quite incredible, really, to reflect upon what searching an entire park may involve. And anyway, any developments in that department, any developments in that field, and we will bring them to you toot sweet. But I can't, as things stand, think of an enlightening or engaging way in which to continue the conversation about the absconded prisoner in the phone-in format. I want to talk instead about something that I need your help getting my head around. The billionaire owner of Tesla and Twitter and all the rest of it, renamed now X, of course, Elon Musk, increasingly sort of got a Bond villain vibe going on, don't you think? But more a bit like Jonathan Pryce. Which one was that? The World Is Not Enough. There's a bit of a Bond villain vibe about this guy. CNN has got hold of a new biography, but well, it's not that difficult, I don't imagine. The author would be delighted with the publicity. But armed submarine drones were approaching their targets being Russian warships off the coast of Crimea, which is, of course, under international law, illegally occupied, has been since, I think, 2012. So you've got Ukrainian drones making their way towards the Russian fleet when, according to the biography, they, and I quote, lost connectivity and washed ashore harmlessly. The biography alleges that Musk ordered Starlink engineers. Starlink is his satellite communications network. Musk ordered Starlink engineers to turn off service in the area because of his concern that Vladimir Putin would respond with nuclear weapons to a Ukrainian attack on Russian-occupied Crimea. That's the thesis of the biography. The apparent confirmation today, it involves a slightly different version of events in which he would decline a request to turn it on rather than actively turn it off. But here's the deal, right? Here is what I consider to be the bottom line. If the communication system had been in place, then Russian warships would have been destroyed, and those Russian warships have subsequently launched missiles into civilian centres in Ukraine that have left countless civilians dead, including children. And Musk didn't turn them on. He's tweeted in the last sort of 24 hours to say there was an emergency request from government authorities to activate Starlink all the way to Sebastopol. The obvious intent being to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor. If I had agreed to their request, then SpaceX would be explicitly complicit in a major act of war and conflict escalation. Well, the easiest way of reading this is that Musk had a chance to shorten the war and chose not to take it. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. I am not going to ask you a particularly complicated question at the end of my own musings and contemplations. I'm just going to ask you straight up what you make of this story, because I don't know if it is quite as black and white as some commentators are describing it, but neither do I know whether Elon Musk is a fella whose word you can take at full face value. So the two conflicting events or accounts seem to me to be relatively moot. Did he decline an offer? Did he decline a request to turn it on, or was it turned off mid-mission, as it were? I think the second account sounds worse than the first, but the ultimate ramifications of either would be exactly the same. We haven't taken our eye off the ball in Ukraine, but obviously when you're covering events that stretch out for months and then possibly into years, then never will you retain the same urgency of reportage that you have in the earliest days. But it continues to be a bloody conflict, a war of attrition, with Ukraine still, according to most accounts, acquitting themselves rather better than anyone had previously expected or predicted. But Vladimir Putin is still in the Kremlin. Well, the fellow who attempted to perhaps unseat him or certainly shake the foundations of his power was shot down in an aeroplane, or certainly is dead as a consequence of an aeroplane crash. And the prospect of him pulling back is zero. So I want you to try, if you can, to get your head into the place where it was when the invasion of Ukraine began. I want you to try, if you can, to get yourself into the place where we were deeply concerned about the exodus of refugees from Ukraine and keen for the British government, the UK government, to do rather more than it genuinely does in the context of refugees fleeing war zones and help citizens provide shelter for refugees. I want you to get into that space where Volodymyr Zelensky was emerging as a hero of our times, and the murderous imperialistic ambitions of Vladimir Putin were, not for the first time, but perhaps with more clarity than ever before, being absolutely demonstrated on the world stage. An indefensible and despicable escapade that means even if he were to try to attend the G20 meeting in India at the moment, he would be running the risk of being arrested for war crimes. So he can't effectively leave Russia. And then you come to Elon Musk. Then you come to the head of Tesla, this curious character with more than an air of Bond villain about him. Turned X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it into a place where anti-Semitism and far-right posters have been enjoying rather more attention than they did previously. Having an opportunity to, not even help really, but just to not hinder is how I would describe it. Language is important, and you're more than welcome to pick up on mine. But he had an opportunity not to hinder a mission which would have scuppered much of the Russian fleet, and he elected to hinder. It's interesting this, isn't it, whether you use the word hinder or help. What do you prefer? So he had an opportunity to help, and if you see the word help, if you use the word help, then his defence has some weight. But if you simply say he had the opportunity not to hinder, then it almost carries a different ethical heft, doesn't it? Anyway, either way, he consciously chose to stymie Ukraine's attempt and ability to blow up Russian warships that have subsequently launched missiles that kill children. What do you think of that? That's all. You can come at it from a 100% philosophical, ethical perspective, or you can come at it with rather more understanding of either matters military, technological, or satellite related. I guess that gets fired under technology. Here's the thing. My initial reaction to this is absolute horror. I use Bond villain as a bit of a throwaway line, but actually even that has a little bit more depth than the simple phrase allows. It is as if he prioritises himself and his business over the lives of Ukrainians. And remember, there is no moral debate or dilemma here. Russia is an illegal invading force. They might as well be the Nazis moving into Poland in the 1930s. And he had the ability to help the invadees, the invaded. And he didn't. And I don't really get it. So I said matters technological, I said matters military, but also I don't know enough about Musk. Perhaps it's matters Musk. Perhaps you, knowing more about him than I do, are unshocked by this apparent act of barbarity. I mean, if you fail if you refuse to hinder something, you become complicit in the consequences. So if I now could press this button, right, or I could release this liquid, or I could open this door, or I could, I don't know, whatever I do. If I now could do something that would provide an enormous fillip to Ukraine and an enormous setback to Vladimir Putin's Russia, I don't think I would spend very long thinking about it. Am I being oversimplistic? Am I being naive? Am I being silly? I would do it. Why didn't Musk? 0345 6060 973. Here is your invitation, your opportunity to spike guns, to really bring it down to brass tacks. Here is your opportunity to help spike guns that will kill children. And Elon Musk said no. Elon Musk said that Ukraine was going too far. Going too far. This is according to the biography, in threatening to inflict a, quote, strategic defeat. He has, of course, threatened to withdraw Starlink communications at various stages of the conflict, but this is the first time it's been alleged that he cut off Ukrainian forces in the middle of a specific operation. So there's a 50-50 here. Did he cut it off in the middle of an operation, or did he refuse to activate it all the way to Sebastopol, or does the actual truth lie somewhere between the two? What seems to me to be inarguable is that Elon Musk had a chance to shorten the war and accelerate a Ukrainian victory, and he chose not to. What do we think of that? Because I don't quite get it. I mean, it can't be everything that comes down to racism, can it? Or a sort of form of white supremacy. But for the last 10 years, whenever you've looked at someone whose popularity seems baffling, whether it's Donald Trump or Farage or anybody else, and you just sort of think, well, all he seems to be offering these people is an endorsement of their racist tendencies or their far-right views. I mean, is there anything else? What else can they possibly be? You're poorer, everything's worse, but you've been allowed to say rude things about Muslims again, or Jews, or whatever it might be. I don't get it. I don't know whether he deserves to be put in that category, but I know that Twitter has become much more of a sewer since he took over. And I don't know that I know enough about him to say that this is characteristic or typical or of a piece with previous conduct, but I do know this. Almost all of us, if given an opportunity to help Ukraine and stymie Putin, would take it. And he appears to have done the opposite. Why? 0345 6060 973. And what do you make of this frankly remarkable? I wonder if this had happened in that week I was telling you to remember 10 minutes ago, when we were talking for the first time about how Moscow expected Kyiv to fall within the first 2 or 3 days of the attack, and Ukraine was supposed to roll over and it would soon be annexed illegally as Crimea had been previously, and we were going to help with an exodus of refugees. You remember that? If this had happened then, if Elon Musk, this sort of poster boy for... what is he a poster boy for exactly? He's sort of Jordan Peterson fans, as far as I can tell, which is pretty terrifying, really. But Elon Musk, in the first week of the war, was revealed to be someone that had essentially helped Russia, or at least failed to help Ukraine, or arguably hindered. Where would we be then? What would we be talking? I mean, what would have happened then? What would the reaction have been then? Also, as Hazel points out, the reason, I mean, she doesn't use the phrase Bond villain, but it is a private citizen having such power and control over such matters that is the real problem. And she adds, this is why no one should be a billionaire. Well, I mean, I don't know if you can quite go that far, Hazel. No one should be able to control communication systems. No private citizen should. But if he's developed the technology, I don't know. There's possibly a conversation for another day there. And again, finally, before we go to the junction, I think you've just answered your own question, James. He could have shortened the war, but money is made during wars, so he didn't. I don't know if he's profiting from, or most very, very rich people generally do. Many, many enormous fortunes have their sources in war, have their roots in war. often people selling to both sides in conflict. This is the nature of humanity in many ways. And I think it was Balzac who said that behind every great fortune, there is a great crime. But I don't know if that applies here. In fact, I'm going to stop saying I don't know, and I'm going to start saying, what do you think? It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 10, and it is, to me at least, a story of almost inconceivable importance. Elon Musk told engineers to turn off a communications network in order to hobble a Ukraine drone attack on Russian warships that would subsequently launch missiles at civilian centres, at Kyiv, at Ukrainian towns. It's almost too big to process, isn't it? But we'll try. Ethan's in Brighton. Ethan, what would you like to say?
So, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.
I work in this space. Not for Starlink, I'd like to point out. Okay. But I work in this space, and I think there's a number of interesting points, but I think your previous point regarding an individual, the head of a company
Yes.
that is privately owned, being able to make those kind of individual decisions.
It's mind-boggling, right?
Is counterintuitive to kind of the idea of the defence industry and stuff, and defence and security especially. So, you know, it's widely reported that these, what we call, it sounds a weird name, but WEBEDs, which is a waterborne IED,
Okay.
which is otherwise referred to as a drone boat. They have a satellite antenna on and they have a satellite link. That's how they are kind of directed, command and controlled. But if we go back a little bit, obviously with Musk, you know, specifically, so that's the main point that I have, that I find it bizarre that a private individual can wield this much individual influence in such an important sphere.
How did it happen? So presumably his company has developed the technology, and forgive my simplistic description, and then put it in the sky. So how could he have been prevented from exercising this sort of influence or power?
Well, regulatory is one.
But under whose authority? Under whose auspices?
Well, there are international bodies that regulate space,
yes.
And then there are international bodies that regulate, the application of defence contracts, but either through national military defences or Ministry of Defences. But I think the point to make here is that Musk has, over the last couple of years, he's quite heavily swerved to the right with his politics and rhetoric, with various different things. But if we go back, Starlink started out as like a commercial home internet service for rural America. That was what it was set up to do. So he's got the money and the capital to launch as many satellites as he wants, and he has to launch thousands of thousands of them because they have what's called a LEO constellation, low Earth orbit constellation, which uses lots and lots of satellites not too far from the Earth's surface.
Okay.
So Starlink didn't come about until after Crimea. There was a lot of regulatory hoo-ha about Ukrainians approving Starlink to actually be used in Crimea because they have to have licenses to operate or to downlink their stuff. There was a lot of interference because of what had happened in Crimea in 2014. Obviously, with all the air defense stuff that's going on, it interferes with the signal and stuff like that.
Okay.
And since then, Musk has constantly said, we're going to pull out funding. In 2022, he said, we're going to pull out funding, reduce funding,
for Starlink.
For Starlink, for the Ukrainian defense systems and stuff like that. So this could be an escalation of that. It could be a simple fact that they lost comms with, if it was one vehicle, maybe, but if it was a whole fleet. He
appears to have confirmed it, albeit under a slightly different reading of events, saying that he turned down an emergency request to activate Starlink all the way to Sebastopol. That's his own language. There was an emergency request from government authorities to activate Starlink all the way to Sebastopol, and they didn't do it. So that rules out the possibility of system failure, doesn't it?
Well, it sounds like it, unless they weren't able to support it because of something in the background, but that sounds far-fetched.
Why, in two sentences, why might he have done it? I mean, his argument is he didn't want to start a nuclear war. Or see his company explicitly complicit in a major act of war, and yet you tell us they're using Starlink all the time.
They have been using Starlink for quite a while.
Yeah.
That's not to say that they weren't using. So you can take something that's not a weapon and use it, and The Ukrainians have been very, very industrious in taking things, cobbling them together, and making very effective like drone weaponry. And you could argue that if for example, if you were a manufacturer of drones, you might say, well, I'm not going to sell them to Ukraine because they're going to strap a grenade to it. So there is that argument that you're taking something that wasn't designed for military application and turning it into that. But that's never come to the forefront, and that's never stopped Starlink before.
No, so that doesn't quite hold water.
It doesn't hold water, and this kind of move to the right, his kind of almost libertarian.
Well, I'd prefer authoritarian, actually, and I think it's a thin line, oddly, given that they're supposed to mean completely different things. But I mean, if we were to pin down psychologically or personally why Musk would have done this, it would appear that he is, I don't know quite what the word is, but he is simpatico with Russia.
And it's also, again, it's all about the man. It's all about the ego.
Yeah. That's why Bond villain is the thing that keeps coming into my mind, because it
doesn't necessarily make business sense for him to do it,
right?
But not that seems to bother him, because he's got more money than sense,
of
potentially.
Course, yes.
It could just be a purely egotistical thing that he's trying to place himself in this geopolitical discussion.
Yeah.
Because he woke up this morning and decided that's what he wanted to do, which is a terrifying thing to contemplate. But that's where my mind went to when I first read about this story this morning.
Right. And that is, I mean, you can't really separate the personal from the political in that sort of context. But the ego being what it is, the existence of the ability to do this doesn't look coincidental or accidental, does it? I mean, he must have known. It's that sort of notion of diabolical genius. Maybe other people didn't realise, you might have done, but the people who should have been paying more attention didn't realise what the ramifications would be when he started launching these satellites in the first place. Everybody, actually, not just Ethan, everybody, I must have got something right in my introduction, because everybody really picking up, in many cases for the very first time, on the notion of a private sector billionaire manoeuvring himself into a position of veto over military operations. I think that's incredible. I'm pretty good with historical context and analogies and comparisons. And, I mean, things have happened in the past, but I don't think it's ever been so completely private sector. Imagine if Oppenheim had been working for Elon Musk. God, I don't know where that came from. James is in Enfield. James, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. So, I mean, firstly, I'd be framing this in the context of the fact that SpaceX has both received government subsidies initially to set up the technology and get this thing up in the first place. But fundamentally, they're a defence contractor in the same way that a Lockheed Martin or a BAE or any of these other military industrial complex companies are. And therefore they have, essentially signed a contract with the Pentagon to deliver connectivity services to what has been defined by the American government and the British government and most Western governments around the world as a strategically important issue of national security. And so therefore, when you enter into those contracts to provide those services, you shouldn't have the right or the ability to decide on a case-by-case basis when you are going to provide those services.
But he does.
Sure.
So what is he then? Is he supranational?
Well, whether his intentions, and I think your last caller hit the nail on the head, it's all about the ego. It's absolutely all about the ego. But I think this is so serious, really, when you have an individual doing this, that it's, to use a very extreme word, it's almost traitorous, really. And,
yes, of course it is. Unless you see Russia versus Ukraine as sort of 50-50, or do you see what I mean? Unless you genuinely sit there and look at this invasion as being something where you don't want to pick a side, then it becomes, in your own mind, it wouldn't be treacherous, would it?
But I think if he had that position, and it seems like to a certain extent he does, for whatever reason,
it's sort of flirting with Dmitry
Medvedev.
Yeah, it's flirting with Medvedev on Twitter in a way. I mean, there is some very odd behaviour there.
Yes, but if he had that position, then don't take a military contract to provide connectivity services to the US government when they're going to be deployed in that arena.
Yeah, it's not quite the same as Lockheed Martin or a military provider, because Starlink has plenty of civilian uses as well.
Yes, but he's contracted to the US government to provide it for security services. So it's not like they're taking the.
But then you move into the same areas that NATO has. The problem that NATO has, don't you? Because you can't. It can't be as a consequence of an American contract that Musk turned Starlink on in Ukraine, because that would involve a breach of NATO rules. That would see the American military machine essentially engaging in an act of war. I think, if I've understood you correctly, this isn't to defend Elon Musk, because as we established at the beginning of your call, he somehow has managed to transcend what you might describe as international scrutiny or international oversight. The idea, just think about this, because, you'll probably be back to being told to get angry about people in small boats by Monday, that there is one man in the world who possesses the power to turn up or down the speed with which the war in Ukraine is over, and he elected not to touch it at all. It's 10:32. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:35 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue to contemplate this frankly remarkable development in the intersection of the war in Ukraine and Elon Musk. Many of you joining me in being more shocked, or as shocked, by the ability of one man, one billionaire, to affect a war of this nature in this way. Almost more shocked than I am by the nature of that intervention, which, according to Musk's biographer, involved a decision to turn off the satellite communications network Starlink as Ukrainian drones approached Russian warships that they intended to hobble. And according to Musk, it simply involved rejecting an invitation or a request to turn on the system. Either way, it meant that the drones washed ashore harmlessly, and the Russian warships went on to launch missiles at Ukraine, which obviously entails launching missiles at civilian centres and killing civilians. Phillips O'Brien has helped us out with these matters in the past and joins us now, the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. We kind of knew but didn't know that this was going on, Phillips.
Well, I mean, it was widely suspected, but Musk came out and tweeted it today. I mean, you can't deny it when he said, I was asked to do this. I was asked to help the Ukrainian attack on the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, and I rejected that opportunity. Now, he presented it as a non-escalatory move. But actually, what he's done is he's lengthened the war. I mean, it's an extraordinary admission. And there's so many things in that admission when you look at it. One, he admits the fleet was at harbor. So actually, a lot of the sailors wouldn't have been on board, i.e. it would have been the safest place to attack them with the lowest casualties. He's also admitting he's made the grain embargo far tougher. Because what a destruction of the Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol would have done is force the Russians to get their naval assets out of Crimea. So they would have to pull them farther away, which would have meant the grain embargo would have been far less effective. So world grain prices would have been lower. I mean, the spillover of all of this. And also, he's basically saying he helped protect the Russian fleet, which has been an asset for Russia lengthening the war. So he has lengthened the war, helped the grain embargo, and made a disastrous choice by his own admission. He's not understanding, I think, what he's admitting.
I don't know how much of a Musk watcher you are, but why do you think he did this?
Well, I've actually muted him on Twitter. But so this was one that people were bringing to my attention. Right. I've never sort of responded to a Musk thing much because I just find him very, very difficult. I have no idea over his psychology, but what seems to happen, I mean, he's very consistent after the opening of the war, when he seemed to be genuinely wanting to help the Ukrainians. Yeah. He's been actually very consistent in wanting to force a deal on Putin's terms. And that seems to be the thrust of what he's saying all the time. Hand over territory, give Putin territory, give Putin a deal. And it could be, the arguments for it are completely inconsistent. On the one hand, it's like, well, Putin might nuke the world. On the other hand, it's like, oh, we need to save poor Ukrainians. But it's all just, it's all arguments for one purpose, which is let's give Putin a deal where he gets a lot of Ukraine, and then I can go back to business.
Yes.
That seems to be
And I mean, people like you and most other experts would contend that is appeasement.
It certainly is self-interest wrapped up in bogus morality.
Well, insofar as a policy of negotiating with Putin, that would be appeasement because he isn't going to suddenly give up his imperialistic ambitions.
No, I mean, I think this is a disastrous decision for Europe. It's a disastrous decision for Ukraine. That if you actually give Putin some kind of victory, you'd force Ukraine to give Putin some kind of victory. You're basically creating instability in Europe now for decades.
How significant is it and how precedented is it for a single individual to have ended up in a position where he exercises such enormous power over war itself?
It's very hard to think of something equivalent in the modern era. You can think in past history, mercenaries, sort of wealthy nobles and all of that. But to think of one person, and admittedly, the richest person in the world, with more resources than anyone else, to do this is, I think, extraordinary. And it leads to a few things. One, I think we have to rethink how we do our security. And looking at it from a European perspective, we as Europeans, and I'm a dual man, I'm American and British, that we need to have strategic autonomy. This is crying out to Europeans to say, you need to have strategic autonomy so that this kind of one person can't determine your fate.
Is it partly perhaps because the post-war settlement had seemed so successful, because the prospect of war returning to Europe had seemed so distant, that while he was launching satellites that he himself has described as being designed to help people watch Netflix and get online for school and do good, peaceful things, nobody really contemplated the possibility that they would be where they are when a war started and capable of doing what they are capable of doing entirely in his gift when shots were fired.
I think that's right. I mean, no one actually considered them the kind of military tool they were, that they were not conceived of that. But I mean, this is the first real conventional war of the internet era. Yeah. There was the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but those are counterinsurgencies. And this is the real war. And by the way, no one would screw with the U.S. internet in war. Musk would never have done this if this was the U.S. in war. He's only doing it because it's Ukraine and he feels he can get away with it. So this is the first time we've seen this kind of power in one person's hands. The only good thing that will come of it is, my guess is he will lose that power.
Well, I was about to ask you, that was about to be my final question, and I'll phrase it, if you don't mind, in journalistic terms. Phil, can the genie get put back in the bottle?
No, I don't think it can. I mean, how do you go back to saying, we can give Musk this power, let him sit there and decide where the internet goes on and where the internet goes off? I don't think European states will stand for it. I certainly don't think the U.S. government will end up standing for it. Though you never know if Trump becomes president, whether it will be delayed, a number of years. Certainly, Musk and Trump have very similar positions on Russia-Ukraine.
Yes.
So it might be slower in the U.S., but I would think eventually it has to go everywhere.
Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews, and just for the record, no relation. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you. It is just turning 10:43. I mean, sometimes when you talk to the experts on the programme, some of the slight sense of excitability, not excitement, diminishes, right? You sort of think, that's good. He's poured some cold water on some of the more fearful analyses that we've been sharing. And sometimes, of course, that doesn't happen. This is an absolutely astonishing situation, a truly astonishing situation. I mean, no wonder the Daily Mail's front page today is about Prince William and Prince Harry. One billionaire, one individual, capable of affecting the course of a war, the length of a war, and electing to use that power to essentially hinder Ukraine and or help Vladimir Putin's Russia. John's in Worthing. John, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Yes, thanks for putting me on after an excellent
fill your boots, John. Come on. What do you think Phillips O'Brien got wrong there, John?
Yeah. I'm definitely going to fix that one. Well, I'm phoning up from the position of a cartoon dog on the internet.
Yes.
As part of the fellas and part of NAFO who fight Russian disinformation online.
Yes.
Which some people may get annoyed about. But, yeah, I mean, obviously with Musk, but everything's been said with regards to the fact that he shouldn't have that power in the first place. But
well, use X as an example of that power, a different exercise of the same it's unaccountable power, isn't it? Over we've been talking about over a system that can affect the length of wars, but of course over the flow of information as well now on Twitter, on X.
Of course, I mean we're seeing this from one point of view, obviously, so we'll be biased. But we over the last year we have seen a big increase in Russian disinformation being sort of pushed to the top of your feed,
right?
Whereas sort of the rebuttals are being hidden. People are being sort of mass blocked. People are being suspended for what we see as nothing really. So it does feel as if we're battling on X as much as
because
everybody else.
He's got that slightly schoolboy notion of freedom of speech, and hasn't he, or that weaponized libertarianism where he thinks all opinions are equal.
Well, yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he just reminds me of that fat 13-year-old that sort of just wanted to be different. He still reminds me of a kid.
You mean the young him? I don't think you're fat shaming, but the young version of him who did sort of just desperate for attention, desperate to be thought funny, desperate to be thought important. But, that would be relatively harmless if it wasn't for the size of the weapons that he wields in the flow of information and I mean, just stop for a minute, all right? I sometimes think I'm going mad. So controlling the flow of information to millions of people and essentially giving Russian disinformation the same feel and weight as actual facts, on the one hand with X, and then on the other hand with Starlink, controlling the length of the war. And electing, under the analysis of Phillips, who is, a world authority, but electing to lengthen the war, increase the casualty count, help Russia. 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49 is the time, and just to compound what Phillips O'Brien up at the University of St Andrews was telling us, Musk did tweet last night, both sides should agree to a truce. Every day that passes, more Ukrainian and Russian youth die to gain and lose small pieces of land with borders barely changing. This is not worth their lives, somewhat overlooking the fact that this would involve Russia retaining occupied land, rebuilding its army, going on the attack again to then take the rest of Ukraine. And there would be, history has taught us, a very high risk of that happening. Also, it's a billionaire pronouncing upon someone else's land, freedom, dignity. It's under that reading, no war ever should have happened. And tempting though it is to subscribe to that school of thought, well, I suppose you do have to be Jeremy Corbyn not to realise how ridiculous it is. Alex is in Manchester. Alex, what made you pick up the phone?
I used to be an Elon Musk fan. I'm not anymore. And a lot of this behaviour is why I'm not an Elon Musk fan. Yes. And it's fairly consistent with how he has been for most of his adult life.
What's happened to him, do you think? I'm not a Musk watcher, but you clearly are. Were the clues there early that he might be this sort of megalomaniac?
He's always been chasing attention, chasing the next headline. And he's always done that to promote his businesses, whether that was the original X.com back in the PayPal days, or the outrageous speed.
But he's not doing that here, though. He's not doing that here, is it? This is very different.
Well, the thing is with that one, he started off getting a lot of publicity of giving and, deliberately shipping lots of Starlink antennas to Ukraine. And he had photos on his Twitter of a truck full of Starlinks in Ukraine, and he got a lot of hit of that at first. But then it began to clash with his new followers, with his new business partners who are very authoritarian. So
there's a lot of Saudi money now in Twitter, isn't there? And
that's the thing.
And the Saudis are about to execute someone for his tweets, I think.
Yeah, and that guy had 10 followers, and he had an anonymous account, and somehow the Saudi government got access to his anonymous account.
And then Elon Musk also, does the Tucker Carlson thing, doesn't he? He's given so Tucker Carlson, probably the biggest disseminator of Donald Trump's lies, busted in depositions to the Dominion lawsuit for hating Donald Trump, but realising there's still more money to be made in pretending that Donald Trump is telling the truth. I mean, the depositions for the Dominion lawsuit are incredible. The exchanges between Tucker Carlson and his own producer are incredible. Again, nowhere near as widely reported as you might hope, but then Musk decides to put this sort of liar-in-chief and cheerleader for the king of the liars to give them a big platform on his... So, I mean, sometimes you try to understand things that are actually incomprehensible. But if you don't believe in truth, then every opinion is equal. The person who is telling the truth and the person who is telling a lie deserve equal weight. And that seems a bit like what Musk is doing.
The big thing for him, the big change for him, from my understanding of it, was when his daughter came out as trans, and he didn't handle that, and he blamed that on left-wing. He blamed that on left-wing things that he found on Twitter, and one of the reasons he brought Twitter was to amplify. What he said was give free speech, was to amplify.
That's why he talks about the woke. Twitter. That's why he talks about the woke mind virus.
Yeah, he could.
Is that where that comes from? Is it?
Yeah, he could not deal with his daughter coming out as trans. He just blew him away. And at that point, he just started then.
And once it's like a rabbit hole. So that's when he's back to being a teenage boy on YouTube, and the trans issue leads him into this issue and that issue, and then the next thing you know, he's a Jordan Peterson fanboy. It's happened to much less wealthy people than Elon Musk. I don't know enough about the issue to add or challenge anything you've said, but it fits into the space available. Thank you, Alex. 10:54 is the time. Leon is in Dresden. Leon, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Interesting opinions here. So what I'm concentrating on was the interview with Isaacson when he said, he rhetorically said, how am I in this war?
Yes.
And that was said after, I think, that the Starlink devices were starting to be used for strategic or tactical or war, in effect, right?
Yeah.
So before that, I mean, lots of people mentioned, I've checked as well, that he was really, 100% behind it, get these Starlink devices to everybody in Ukraine to see YouTube, whatever, or X, whatever it is.
Yes.
But when it starts to go wrong, when it starts to be used in military operations, that's when I think he showed his true colours. I mean, I say true colours, but he's a businessman. He's a CEO. All businessmen don't deal with deaths. Well, no. Most don't. But I don't know if I'm sort of coming across okay, but, a CEO won't deal with, just execution and, shooting people.
Some do, but I don't think that, electric cars and satellites to help people watch Netflix necessarily he saw on the horizon finding himself in this position of influence. I think this is possibly a sympathetic analysis of how he ended up in the position he ended up in, but not a sympathetic analysis of what he's done now he's found himself in that position.
No, because he's panicked. I think he's in a panic situation because he's asking lots of rhetorical questions.
But he also thinks he's a genius.
Starlink. I don't.
No, but he does.
I don't. Oh, yes, of course, yeah, because you've got that sort of mindset of a...
You could almost see him putting his little finger in the corner of his mouth, couldn't you, when he's contemplating something?
Yeah, $1 million. Exactly like dollars.
Yeah.
But he is just an aggressive, short-term sort of focused person. So when the job's finished, he goes on, moves on to the next one, leaves some people to figure out all the details. So this is when he's done something off the cuff, gone off to do something else, and now it's come back to haunt him. That this is now being used, his stuff is being used, and he's trying to make the stockholders, inverted commas, happy with his decisions. So that's my opinion.
Up to the point that you sort of wonder how you see the decision to deliberately lengthen the war as somehow contributing to curtailing it. And I guess that thing, I mean, it's such a cop-out, this, which is why I mentioned Jeremy Corbyn a moment ago. I just wish both sides could come to some sort of peaceful solution. Christ, that was nearly our foreign policy. Well, it wasn't nearly our foreign policy, but it was conceivably our country's foreign policy. Why can't everyone just get along? And I think Musk is obviously cleverer than Corbyn. So is my cat. But the the cop-out nature of it is exactly the same. He's found himself in a very difficult situation, and he is avoiding making difficult decisions by coming out with a meaningless platitude of why can't they all just get along? And that leads him into the position where he can't make a conscious decision to shorten the war because it would involve picking a side. And he subscribed to a school of thought philosophically that has to see all sides as being equal because his freedom of speech shtick has been lifted almost wholesale from the darkest recesses of Twitter. And that's the end of my TED Talk. Thank you, Leon. Last word, I suspect, looking at the time, to Jason in Bushy. Jason, what would you like to say?
Elon Musk is a fascist. Not Nazi. It's not about colour. It's about the rentier economy. Basically, he's above everybody else, and everybody else out there is meant to do what he wants. Therefore, he doesn't want to upset Putin or China because there's lots of rich billionaires that buy his cars. And the rest of us are there just to make the money for him. I'm a news geek. There was a thing in something. Have you ever heard of Jezebel, an American news site?
No.
He's got 3 partners with 10 children.
Right.
And one of them was recently pushing something out because she hasn't seen her kids in 2 years because he won't let her.
Right.
He's just so arrogant.
So
he doesn't care about the rest of us.
You're using the word fascist to describe someone who believes in a sort of innate superiority, someone who believes in a. So he has ended up as the richest man in the world because he is a superior creation.
Fascism is the control of government with rich people.
Oh, you're going that far? Okay.
To the detriment of everybody else.
Yes.
It's not about colour.
No, I understand that. I was just clarifying. So
no, I'm going the real sort of total fascist. You know.
Well, fair enough. He's a big fan of freedom of speech, as we know, so he'll be comfortable with that. What is in your mind, the simplest explanation for why he elected not to shorten the war?
Because he doesn't want Russia to lose, because that way he would lose a lot of billionaires that would buy his cars. And that would upset China.
Not that many. There might be something broader in the idea of business being affected, but there aren't enough Russian billionaires to make a massive difference to the sales figures of Tesla cars, I wouldn't have thought. But again, it's a subject I don't know quite enough about. Thank you, Jason. It's just coming up to 11 o'clock. That was brilliant. Thank you so much to everyone who rang in, and of course to Phillips. Still, after all these years, despite all the evidence to the contrary, when we come on air with something like that, there's still a little bit of me that worries that we're biting off more than we can chew. But of course, we hardly ever are. In fact, I don't think we ever have bitten off more than we can chew. And that, of course, is down to the people who feel compelled or comfortable enough to call in with some fascinating understandings and insights. It's 11 o'clock.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 3 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know if you were listening yesterday, but I got something wrong. I made a what's the word? A misstep, a bad call. Unlike Boris Johnson, I don't get all the big calls right. You could die of sarcasm, couldn't you, some days? Because I tried to spin 2 plates at the same time. I thought I was being so clever. When I suggested that we could talk about the really quite astonishing cost of veterinary bills on the one hand and the quite astonishing cost of childcare on the other. And we could poke a little bit of fun at the idea that some people perhaps think their pets are more valuable to them than their children and it didn't work. Can you imagine? You can only answer this question now if you were not listening yesterday. Can you, Keith, put your hand down. Can you imagine why it didn't work? The phones went absolutely bonkers, as they usually, but don't always do, of course. Anyway, quality is more important than quantity. Can you imagine why it didn't work, despite the switchboard exploding? If you weren't, can you imagine? Have a think. Go on. So what I tried to do is do 2 topics at the same time, which is always a little bit risky, but this was, I thought, an open goal, absolute shoo-in. We'll do 50% on how much vets cost and 50% on how much childcare costs. Switchboard explodes, absolute disaster. It was great radio and the phone-in worked, but the plan to do 2 topics didn't work. I've given you so many clues. If you haven't worked it out by now, then frankly, I don't know if there's anything else I can do to help you. For reasons that I don't understand, There were so many calls in the first 5 minutes about veterinary bills that nobody ringing in about childcare costs could get through. The switchboard filled up. Let me describe to you how it works. I sort of have 10 blocks in front of me, each one representing a phone line, and they fill up with someone ringing in. And I can watch it happen. I can physically watch it happen. And you couldn't get back through for a whole hour. You couldn't have got through because every time I said goodbye to someone who'd been ringing in about veterinary costs, in that nanosecond of time available, someone else rang in about veterinary costs. I think there were a couple of childcare costs, but the producer decided they weren't very interesting. So it failed miserably because nobody who wanted to talk about childcare costs was as quick with their fingers as people who wanted to talk about veterinary costs. So I want to make something absolutely crystal clear. Do not phone me about animals between now and 12 noon. I do not want to hear it. I think we'll be returning to that subject because there is something I suspect going on, and there is indeed an investigation into whether there is indeed something going on. But I don't want to talk about that. It was a mistake of mine because I am genuinely fascinated by what the hell has happened to childcare costs. I think part of the problem is the window in which they really matter is quite small, isn't it? Most of us, and don't text me to say, actually, I've got 11 children who range in age from 44 to 3. Most of us have our children in a relatively small window. Usually there's a 2-year gap if you've got 2 kids. If you've got 3 or 4 kids, maybe you're covering an 8-year window. Most of us have a relatively small window of childcare. We can, I think this is crucial, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe that's part of the reason why this does not get the what was the word I forgot yesterday when I was talking about oh, come on, what's the word I want? Engagement, anyway, it doesn't get the consistent, sustained attention that it deserves because your investment in it is quite brief and by definition temporary. Your child and or children will soon pass through this period in which this phenomenon is so live for you, so urgent. So that's the challenge, isn't it? Is to oh yeah, whatever, James, we got through it. It's all over now. Kids are at school. Kids are grown up. Kids are left home. God, childcare costs were crippling when I was young, and they're crippling now. Yada yada yada. It will soon pass. It's insane now. It's absolutely insane. As a piece in the I newspaper by a journalist called Hannah Fern talks about her stomach lurching as she opened the email. The manager of her daughter's nursery was reluctantly informing me that due to the cost of overheads, including energy bills and food prices, their rates were going up again. I held my breath as I clicked on the attachment which provided a personalised invoice. And there it was. Going to work is now costing my family £949 a month for only 3 days childcare a week for just one child. The headline is actually incredible. It's incredible because it is simultaneously striking and completely feasible. The headline on this article is, would I have been able to justify starting a family if these had been the costs involved 10 years ago? It is, she writes, an existential problem, the extortionate cost of childcare, because at some point, if things continue in the current direction, people are going to elect not to have children at all because they cannot do the sums. Thank you, paying more attention than I was to my own programme yesterday. The word I was looking for indeed was charged. Why is this not a more charged issue? My first answer to that question is the length of the tunnel. So if you were paying £949 a month for only 3 days childcare a week for the next 20 years, I think that the actual weight of public opinion would have fixed the problem. I think that the pressure put on politicians to fix this would be so immense that it would be fixed by tea time. Because you're looking down a 20-year-long tunnel and you cannot make ends meet. But because it is a 2, a 3, a 4-year window, or a 5, a 6, a 7-year window, it's finite. That is why perhaps the pressure is not brought to bear on the politicians in the way that it clearly needs to be. And it is hugely sexist as well. It's hugely discriminatory because, again, most, not all, so don't text me to say, well, I am a man and I look after children. Most arrangements will involve the woman a female partner dropping out of the rat race during the early years, the intense years of child rearing. So if you don't keep your foot in the game, then you run the risk of never recovering your earnings again. If you want to keep your foot in the game, then you are essentially working in order to just sort of keep it afloat. You don't make any profit from your job. You don't have any money left at the end of the month as a consequence of your work, because it almost all goes directly to the nursery, to the childcare. And I don't get it. I don't understand. I can't quite do a topic of why do we put up with this, because the answer is we have no choice. But there are 2 or 3 questions here, and I've stumbled across the first one, which is that the numbers are so utterly ridiculous, that you would expect this to be a much, much bigger issue than it is, a much more charged issue than it is. Every now and then, a story like this comes along. Everybody has a sharp intake of breath. Most of us congratulate ourselves of not having been caught in the crosshairs of the current situation. And everybody who is in it just sort of sighs exasperatedly and dreams of the day when they're out of it. How have we ended up in a situation where presumably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are going to work in order to pay for childcare and have next to nothing left over at the end of the month? So I like the broader question. I always like the broader question. We will zone in on the detail in just a moment. But how has this happened? Either logistically or even philosophically. How has this happened? How have we ended up in a place where it costs you your own income to pay for your child to be looked after? There's almost a breakdown in logic here. But I need your help in pinpointing it precisely. 0345 6060 973. It's a very good point already coming in. If it's less of an issue, James, or it's less charged because it's seen as a woman's problem. If men took on responsibility for primary care, it would be very different. It's a bit like menstruation, isn't it? You know, if men had periods, then the amount of money that would have been spent on medical research and the free provision of sanitary products would be, well, it'd be taking a bite out of GDP, but they don't. It's women, so you just have to crack on and get on with it, girls. That's me being sarcastic, by the way, just for the avoidance of doubt. But I think you're right. If it was men who were caught in this conundrum, if it was men who had to essentially choose between working for nothing or... And more men will be, of course, because you're approaching this now as a double act, but it is almost always the woman upon whose shoulders the bulk of the burden will land. So why? And I don't really want to ask you this question because it must be an almost inconceivably difficult situation in which to find yourself. But are you contemplating childlessness as a consequence of costs? 0345 6060 973. So, question number 1, fairly straightforwardly, how has this happened, and or why do we put up with this? Question number 2, the impact on your life and your family and your future. And it's unexpected because I've often said to you with regard to elderly care that it's the mothership of subjects about which you know nothing until the point where you need to know everything. You go from knowing absolutely nothing about putting a relative into care until you need to know everything. In that moment, I need to know everything. I need to know it now. I need to know it yesterday. Last week I knew nothing. Today I need to know everything. Childcare is not quite the same because you've got a longer run up and you start making inquiries long before it's actually needed. Yesterday we read about someone who had put their fetus down for 3 months before they'd even told family members they were pregnant. They'd booked a place at a local nursery because they are increasingly at such a premium. So the partly expected but probably not fully appreciated impact of this situation on you. I genuinely find it incredible. And when my oldest was born, we were in quite a different place from where we are now. We've had an amazingly, I've been very, very lucky over the last nearly 20 years work-wise. And so we're in a much stronger position than we were then. But when I look at these numbers and I think about what our income was and what we were doing, £949 a month for only 3 days childcare a week. So you've gone down to 3 days at work when you were previously full-time. And what you're earning by the time the taxman's had his bit by the time your income tax has been paid, what you actually have left at the end of the month is almost all going directly to the people looking after your child. And I genuinely don't get it. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. And I notice a lot of men ringing in, and that's good today. I'm fine with that. I want a good mix. I'd say it's about 30% men. Normally on a subject like this, the way I've set it up, I say, "Oh, don't ring me up if you're a bloke." But no, because this is a family issue. This is a family issue, and the finances of it are utterly bonkers. They're broken. Crikey, under my glorious rule, first thing I'd do, however much it costs. For all the shtick he gets. You look at Sadiq Khan, you look at the Mayor of London. There are two big things he's done in the last month. He's brought in ULEZ and he's brought in free school meals for every kid in primary schools in London. Those are big, bold political steps, whether you approve of them or not. If you want politicians to do things, then you'd have to acknowledge that they are big, big things. Why would a government not campaign on providing proper levels of free childcare to huge numbers of families up and down the country? Just extend it, if you like, from the first year of primary school to 2 years earlier. It would be hugely expensive, but it would also create jobs, and everyone would be paying for it. And, of course, anybody objecting to paying for childcare and or education is, by definition, an idiot, because educating future generations is probably the single most important thing you can do to safeguard the health of future economies. It's 17 after 11. Hit the numbers now. You will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 11 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where both the reality of the situation in which you find yourself and the reasons for the broader crisis of childcare, the numbers are absolutely phenomenal. And it's not pie in the sky to suggest that this is actually going to affect the birth rate. Here you go. James, people are already not having kids due to childcare costs. We have a 2-year-old. It costs £500 a month for 1.5 days of nursery per week. There's no way that we could afford to have another child and double that bill. So we're not. 20 minutes after 11 is the time. I don't quite understand how it's happened. Oh, and that was it. I need to read you something that if you are, I've got to warn Gemma, who's up first, and then Sammy, that you're gonna spit nails when I read you this tweet that's just come in, because this is really the proof of the pudding, as it were. Hugo is in Austria, where he runs a rather lovely bed and breakfast, and he's tweeted me to say, "I'm flabbergasted. Here in Austria, I would pay €66 per month for 3 days with flexible hours between 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. Lunch is an extra €4.50 a day. €66 for 3 months. Hannah Fern, writing in the I newspaper yesterday, describes £949 a month. What have we done to deserve this? As Neil Tennant once so pertinently asked, almost. Gemma's in Beckenham. Gemma, what's going on?
Oh, hi, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
So I have got 2 children and I work full-time in the city for a predominantly male environment.
Right.
And I've had to increase my working as the children have got older, so that's great. But there's still the wraparound care even when they're at school, which costs money, the after-school clubs.
Yeah.
The before school clubs. And as you were saying earlier, it's predominantly the woman, the mum, who has to dash off from the office to the school for, wraparound care. We're talking 5:30 where, my colleagues will work till 6.
Right.
And there's still that stigma, I think, as a working woman in the city that you're kind of, you're going to get your kids now. There's that kind of... And as I was saying to your producer, we had an email that came out on a Thursday that basically a blanket email across the board to say from next Monday, we now want everybody in 4 days a week in the office with optional work from home on Friday.
There's a lot of that coming out now. We may do it in the next hour, actually. You've just given us an early taster. Quite a few companies are now laying down the law on this, which presumably makes a much bigger difference to you than it does to many of your colleagues.
Exactly, because a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have got wives who do not work and are full-time stay-at-home mums, which is great. But for people like me, I can't afford to do that. So for me, going from 3 days working in the office to 4 is huge.
Yes.
It's massive. And I just think, it's really, really tough. Whatever you do, I've done the 3 days. I was paying over £1,000 for my son to be in nursery when he was a baby. He had to go back at 9 months old, and we had to put him in to a nursery in the city and all commuting in the morning so that he could be nearer.
And then you could pick him up.
Exactly. So it's
what do you think? How do you
juggle.
explain it? So listen, here's Hans in Austria listening to this, paying €66 a month, and that's flexible between 7 and 4 p.m.
Yeah.
So you don't need any wraparound care at the start of the day. But well, how has it happened? How have we ended up in a situation where you're paying? I mean, nearly. I'm very bad at maths. You're the one in the city. Whatever you have to divide 1,000 by to get 66. It's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
How has that happened? How have we ended up at this with the dirty end of this particular stick? I've got no idea.
No idea. No. And as I say, in my team, we're all women, and I'm the only one with children. So I think that says quite a lot as well.
Crikey.
Because I do think a lot of people are choosing career over kids because of the money.
And it shouldn't be either or. It shouldn't be
No.
either or. And of course, I turn on your telly this time next week and there'll be some, or turn on a different sort of radio phone-in show and there'll be some half-wit saying, well, if you can't afford children, you shouldn't have them. And you're talking to people potentially with 2 decent salaries, such as the state of the childcare crisis. Gemma, thank you. Sammy's in Chelmsford. Sammy, what would you like to say?
Hiya. Sorry, a bit nervous.
Oh, it's only me.
I know. So I've got 3 children. They're 6, 9 and 11.
Right.
I came out of full-time care when I had my second child, just purely because of the childcare costs. And, obviously that's sort of 6, 7 years ago now. And we did have family helping us as well, but it didn't make financial sense to work and bear that cost.
Yes.
But equally, going into full-time care, and even now they're at school and they're out at that early years stage, you still have to consider, like the last caller said, it's the wraparound care. So as much as I'd actually, I'd be quite happy to work full-time now, it doesn't make sense. I can't find that job that's flexible enough to do your before and after school pickup. I'm not paying for sort of childcare for free
of course.
Children. That of course just,
it's prohibitive. It's prohibitive.
Yeah.
I wonder, it's almost sometimes as if the system of work that the employer really hasn't caught up anything like as much as they need to with the fact that both parents, if it's a 2-parent family, both parents now work. And if it's a 1-parent family and mum or dad wants to work, then you can pretty much double all of the problems that we're describing here as 2-parent families.
Yeah, definitely. And
them.
there's also that you also have to sort of look at, if you've been out of your career for a while, it's trying to get back in. You're almost starting from the beginning. So your wage isn't going to be particularly high getting back into it. And, they're saying what the average salary might be for families, but it's not realistic into what the actual cost of family is, and then chucking the cost of living crisis on top of it as well.
Well, and interest rates and all the rest of it. But what you've highlighted there as well, of course, is the reason why some women got pushed through it, despite the fact that they might even be running at a loss, because when you get to the end of the period of looking after them all day, and you want to go back to work, you're going back 4 rungs down from where you were when you left, and it's harder to get back to where you. So you can understand why people don't do it. But obviously for you, the money made that choice.
Well, I spent a few years as well, worked sort of out of hours, because I thought, I've got 3 children now. My husband's bringing in a good enough wage, but everything's still picking up, and I want to get back into the office. But that obviously meant giving up your evenings and weekends to try and fund a new career, and you're doing that on the back of the school runs and looking after family and house as well. So it's just exhausting.
It's more than exhausting. It's close to impossible. Guess what? I mean, I almost hesitate to tell people this stuff, but Gemma moved to Limoges in France in 2019 with a 2 and a 4-year-old. The childcare they were paying in this country at that time, so this is full time, and that was €2,500 for the 2 of them. In France, it was €300.
Wow. Yeah, something needs to change.
Well, it's a political decision. Subsequent governments have taken this political decision, but of course we've only had one party in power for the last 13 years. I don't really get it, because surely it would be a massive vote winner. Oh, we can't afford it. Well, then how can France? Oh, we can't afford it. Well, then how can Austria? I'm sure there are answers to these questions. I'm not speaking rhetorically, but my goodness me, it's a mess. Thank you, Sammy. Take care. Stephen's in Milton Keynes. Stephen, what would you like to say?
We've got hi James, first time calling, love your show.
Very kind.
we've got a daughter who's just started childcare, literally started this week.
Right.
She does 3 days a week. The cost of that on a monthly basis is more than our mortgage. So to put in perspective, 3 full days a week is £1,014 a month, which is, and we're fortunate that is more than our mortgage, but we also are coming at the end of our 5-year fixed rate.
Oh, no.
So next July, we are not entirely 100% sure how much our mortgage is going to go up by because of that uncertainty.
Well,
but
probably not as much as it would have done this July, if that's any consolation, but fingers crossed.
But it's still going to be a jump.
Yeah.
My wife works full-time in London. She has a varied schedule. She can sometimes work weekends. I mean, don't even get me started on trying to find childcare on the weekend.
Sure.
I also work the odd weekends as well. We both have full-time jobs. I also have a second job that I do from home as well. And I'm in a fortunate position that, and I hate doing this because it is difficult, but I've very kindly, my dad has offered to help out with the payment for childcare.
Right. And
I just feel sometimes I can't believe the age I am that I have to accept that help, and he's happy to give it. And of course, like, I am in that privileged position that I know that some people don't. But
no, you don't want to be. You don't want to be relying on your old man.
Of course you don't. But also, it's made us have a discussion about, are we going to have a second? And I think we've come to sort of this decision that we might not be able to afford it. And that's literally what the conversation has ended at. It's not about not wanting to. Yeah. It's about, and we both, I've got a sibling, my wife's got a sibling.
Right.
And it's that point of, can we risk that, because who knows what will happen in the next 5-10 years.
Why do you think it's not more charged? Because I don't know if you heard my theory that because the window you're describing is quite small, but you've added an extra dimension to it actually, because it might be a small window, but it could be the difference between you having another baby and not having another baby, between your little girl growing up with a sibling and not growing up with a sibling. I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but your choice is being taken away from you effectively. So even if we only endure the epic costs for a relatively small amount of time, that the implications and the ramifications actually can last a lifetime. So and listen, I've not come up with much, so there's no embarrassment if you can't answer this question. Why do you think it's not a bigger issue politically?
I mean, this isn't my opinion, but perhaps there is a certain political element in which having more than one kid is a luxury.
Or providing help. In any way. So, you can't get rid of the state education, can you? Because that would be like trying to get the eggs out of a baked cake. But goodness knows, anything that involves public spending is like kryptonite to these ghouls and vampires from Tufton Street that have completely infiltrated the Tory part. Maybe that's why. Imagine if you had a secretly funded lobby group that was dedicated to promoting free childcare for all. And it was getting invited on to LBC all the time, and BB could call it the Institute of Free Childcare, for example. I could be the head of education or the general secretary of the Institute of Free Childcare. Completely secretly funded. No one's got a clue where the money's from, but I'll be on the telly every day. I'll probably have a column in the Sunday Times. It's free childcare for all, free childcare for all. You could turn this into a massive issue by tea time. But, of course, no one wants to secretly fund that, because you only secretly fund organisations when you're trying to improve your own financial situation, not improve or enhance or increase public spending. Stephen, I wish you well. Again, trying to imagine me 17 years ago contemplating some of these questions, and I get even more confused about how it has been permitted to transpire in this way. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
25 minutes to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where what's the word? Prohibitive, punitive, crippling costs of childcare concern us regularly on the programme. It's a bit of a hardy perennial, but every time we talk about it, the situation has got worse than it was last time we talked about it. And one element we've introduced recently is the comparisons with other European countries. I suppose we're going to have to stop comparing ourselves with other European countries soon, aren't we? And compare ourselves instead with the countries that we have trade deals with. So I don't know, what's the childcare situation like in India? because still governed by people who seem to think that the economies that we should be closest to are the ones that are furthest away. So Austria, France, I don't know what the situations are elsewhere, but I know in Scandinavia they probably make the French model look punitive, and yet here in the UK we are paying through the nose. And I think the short answer is the government does next to nothing to help. And that just seems odd to me. And I don't have an answer as to why it would be. But I also want to know, of course, the impact it has upon you, the changes it's made to your family, to your future, to your life. A couple of phone lines free now, 0345 6060 973. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Is it Marwa in Croydon?
Very good, Marwa.
Marwa. Marwa,
Yeah,
what would you like? Welcome. What would you like to say?
So I was in full-time employment in quite a good role. I have a law degree, so and have qualified, so that probably gives you a bit of an idea. I went for baby number 2, or actually we were unsure whether we should have baby number 2 because of the cost of childcare for baby number 1.
Right.
And found out I was pregnant with twins.
Gosh.
So went from 1 to 3.
Yeah.
And then had 3 little ones in nursery at the same time. So I've had to reduce the hours that I work and gone from full-time to 3 days a week.
Right.
Because the cost to have them in nursery was £1,500 a month, and that's for only 2 days. And now I have 2 other jobs on top of my current role. So I'll do my normal role, pick up the kids, and then my husband will come home and I'll go back out to work again.
Good grief.
And then on the days off, I'll also look after the kids and do some more work. But I think what we also don't really think about and talk about is how the gender pension gap starts to fall into play.
Because you're not doing your contributions.
Absolutely, and your contributions have gone down from 5 days to 3 days.
Yeah.
And we do this for a prolonged period of time. So it's not just the here and now, it's actually our futures, in the long run. And I'm married and hopefully we stay together and all of that. But if that doesn't happen, then, it's not just, my life that will change now. So,
this is another reason why my lazy answer to the question of why we put up with it has not really lasted very long. You've got the possibility of not having another child.
Yeah.
And you've got the possibility of having your pension scuppered or measurably diminished. I mean, it's still a relatively small window, but how easy will it be when the twins have gone to school for you to slide back into 5 days a week work in the job that I presume you prefer to your side hustles?
Well, interestingly enough, I would say now I don't.
Oh, okay. Well, that's nice then. Every cloud, eh? I mean,
about it. It's more because so I could slide back into the role that I'm in and go up to 5 days a week. However, there's already people who I was, more senior than, and I've always been quite career driven, who have now exceeded me.
That's tough
already
as well.
From the time off. So
that's like a soft penalty, isn't it, rather than a hard penalty?
Absolutely. So I think what I'll be looking to do is build up the work that I'm doing around that. And strangely enough, I started doing equality, diversity and inclusion consulting to speak just about these issues. So,
yes.
Oh, you can hear one in the car.
Well, no, I can just to prove it. And briefly, Mara, if you can, if you're not too busy juggling, how do you think this has happened? When I tell you what the score is in France, or when I tell you what the score is in Australia, Paige was paying $500 a month full time in Minnesota. But that's not that. So America's probably more close to us than other European countries are. Have you got any clue as to why we have almost sleepwalked, as Richard puts it, into this situation as a country?
I think that's a big question, and I don't want to go too much into my thoughts of the government, but I honestly think that they're just so out of touch with what life is like for women and just for real working people. It's unbelievable how little they know about, or in my opinion, care about what
just the normal. I don't want to call it the daily grind because it's family life. It's just the normal existence. The quotidian, I think, is the fancy word for it. Mawa, thank you. And to read out Richard's tweet in full, we've sleepwalked into this childcare crisis as more and more households have become two adults working rather than the traditional housewife role. We've got 11-month-old twins and pay £120 per day, 3 days a week. I've had to drop a day as a teacher to save money. To save money. You're doing less work. That's absolutely counterintuitive. It's absolutely bonkers. Here's a good point, and it's usually me that makes this point, Becky. Well played. Childcare doesn't get the attention, perhaps, because it's people who are working, so they can't be demonised unless they claim benefits, and the Daily Mail isn't interested in talking about social care unless it's to demonise the recipients because of ideology. I suppose that would be the only way you could inflate this story is, but I don't even know how you could do that, actually. So, and Alexander in Maidenhead says, I don't think free childcare would go down very well with those who don't have children. You mentioned the lady receiving 3 days of childcare, £900 a month. It sounds reasonable to me for good childcare. Maybe you don't agree, says Bridget in Maidenhead. Well, I'd hate to break it to you, Bridget, and you might want to sit down before I tell you this, but people who don't have children are already paying for every child in the country to be educated. So the idea of just extending that a few more years backwards in order to ensure that we have, a fluid, well-run economy strikes me as absolutely blindingly obvious. But you do you. Saskia's in Tooting. Saskia, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
Hi.
Saskia.
Hello. I'm coming at it from a completely different angle. I'm a childminder in southwest London, know many childminders and nurseries.
Yes.
And these are not extortionate costs. As you've just read out, finally somebody's saying something sensible. That is not an extortionate cost.
What is
for
it?
your child? £80, £70 a day to be in childcare, nappies, wipes, food, excursions, all the
I think the thrust of the conversation is, this is why the comparisons with France and Austria are so pertinent. The thrust of the conversation isn't about the job that you do not being worth what you pay. It's about the absurdity of it coming...
You're calling them extortionate. They're not extortionate.
No, if you'd let me explain, then we can avoid these crossed wires. So no one is saying that the amount of money being paid for the childcare is extortionate. What's extortionate is the fact that it's coming out of the pay packets of mum and dad, whereas in other countries the government is picking up the huge majority of the bill, while the total bill remains the same size.
Okay, but that's not been the thread of what you're talking about yesterday and today.
We talked about vets yesterday.
Extortionate cost because you're putting costs on it of this much for that many days, this poor person's paying that. It's not a luxury to have a child. If you can't afford to send your child to childcare, then don't.
You're going there. You're going to the...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's not a God-given right. And there are and you're talking about it's not free, but as you know, I'm sure you've talked about it before, from next year, there's an introduction of a free childcare across the board, which again is not free. It's a supplement towards our income. There is a general thread, and it's often on LBC, that childcare costs are unfair and extortionate, and this kind of poor parents having to work to pay for childcare costs.
Yes.
That's somebody else's environment, that's somebody else's work. This is our career, how we earn money to support our families. The general thread for LBC is that these costs are extortionate, whoever is footing them, James.
Okay, well, I'm glad you put your point forward. I mean, it's unfortunate that you've gone to the if you can't afford children, don't have them space, but someone always does.
I absolutely believe that.
No, I know. I don't doubt you for a minute. I don't doubt you for a minute. Okay.
Single-handedly, it is not your luxury for you to then go out, have your job, your career. This is our job and our career.
Yeah, I know. I'm saying I'm glad that you've made that point.
Because we are fed up of hearing it. And also these costs that are coming out, different parts of the country, nurseries and childminders are also charging a lot less. Some people are charging, I know, £30 a day. £30 a day for a child to be fed, nappies, outings, excursions, meeting the Ofsted requirements.
So let me just run one thing by you, if I may, because the examples we've been using, the same nursery, eldest child, £64 a day in 2018, and it's now £100. So that's in 5 years.
Absolutely. you.
That's at 5 years. That's an increase of almost 50%. So the reasons for the use of the word extortionate will be largely...
No, £64 a day 6 years ago.
I'm going to have to finish a sentence at one point, all right?
Sorry, we're very,
No,
very
apparently
upset.
not. It's 11:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:49. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm not sure that I do need to explain this, but I will anyway. If your childcare goes up by 50% in the space of 5 years, then at the beginning of that process, you could afford it. And at the end of that process, you can't afford it. So to factor into the mix the idea that if you can't afford to have children, you shouldn't have had them, poses the question of what do you do with the ones that you could afford to have when childcare was affordable, now that it isn't? Is there a place you can take them? Do you hand them in at a depot at your local? Get them a job with the local chimney sweep? I don't know. That is, of course, why it is such a pertinent question to ask. How come in Italy now? I've heard from Italy, in France, in all of the comparable European countries, the cost of childcare for parents is a fraction of what it is in the United Kingdom, and why that might be is a question for the ages. 03456060973 is the number you need if you can answer it. But Fraser Knight is here, LBC's reporter, has been looking at some of the broader issues brought into play by the escape of this prisoner, Daniel Khalif. Fraser, what have you been looking at?
You're right, James. Of course, the escape of Daniel Khalif has brought into this debate, the wider issue of prison capacity. For months, really, we've been hearing about how few spaces there are in prisons. And the figures out today show that that's still a huge issue. 987 spaces is all we have in our prisons for anyone to move into. But LBC's analysis has shown that of those, there's fewer than 200 spaces in Category A prisons. Now, they are the maximum security prisons that are often reserved for the most serious crimes. If you're looking at murder, manslaughter, attempted murder, or sexual assaults like rape and those sorts. And just for a bit of context, with 189 spaces in those high security prisons just now, that's about the same as the number of charges brought against accused rapists every month in this country. And it just shows how little space there are in prisons. Of course, Daniel Khalif's escape has brought around questions over whether he was in the correct prison, Category B prison at HMP Wandsworth, whether if you're awaiting trial for terror offences, whether you should be actually in a higher security prison. It really has just brought that right into the debate. The review, of course, underway.
So it raises the possibility that a terror suspect is in a less secure prison because the space is needed for prisoners who may be deemed more of an immediate risk to the public or more in need of high security.
Well, of course, there's always the consideration that's made by judges who look at not only the crimes in front of them, the risk that might be there of someone fleeing the country if they have the opportunity to do that, if they're allowed out on bail, but also that prison capacity issue. I mean, every day almost I'm sitting in courtrooms where I hear judges talking about the lack of space in prisons when they're considering sentencing, when they're looking at the length of terms, but then also that consideration needs to be brought in when you're looking at where to put prisoners. So if you're in a space where you have 189 spaces available in those maximum security prisons, you're going to be weighing up those crimes that are in front of you. Do you put someone who's waiting for trial on terror offences into one of those spaces, and then the next day you've got a serious murderer, a serial killer who comes along, and they absolutely need to be put into those high security prisons?
Fraser Knight, many thanks indeed. There's no updates, I presume, on the Daniel Khalif investigation?
We know there have been searches. Richmond Park this morning in London was among them, but no confirmed sightings so far. We've heard, some activity.
It's incredible,
coming.
That, isn't it?
It is. And actually, yesterday I was speaking to Commander Dominic Murphy from the Counter-Terrorism Command, and he was talking about the ingenuity that Daniel Khalif had shown in his escape, managing to evade any sightings as a part of that. He says that he is a very resourceful man, and it's rare that we would, have such a wide public appeal and no confirmed sightings on the third day of him being out of prison.
Well, keep an eye on it for us. I'm sure
will.
you will. Thank you, Fraser Knight. 11:54 is the time. Fraser, of course, an LBC reporter. Another LBC reporter has done another cracking job. Emma Core. I don't know if you're across this story. You can see it at our website, lbc.co.uk. But costing so far over £500,000 they've spent on the empty barge that, of course, the asylum seekers couldn't inhabit because of the discovery of Legionella. I'd go for £500,000. Funny what the newspapers choose to get angry about and don't, isn't it? But there you go. Have a look at that story at lbc.co.uk and indeed at Fraser's investigation into Category A prison places. It is 11:55. Back to the extortionate cost of childcare. Chris is in Bromley. Chris, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon, James. Thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
So I have a daughter who's 3 years old who currently goes to nursery. So me and my partner both work full-time jobs. Also, what's not taken into consideration, it's when there's things such as bank holidays. So my daughter goes to the nursery Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. And what's not taken into consideration when there's things such as like bank holidays on a Monday or there's a Ofsted report. We still have to pay for those days even though we're unable to send my daughter to nursery.
What we've got is a model now, an economic model, where in two-parent families, both parents work. It's a given, certainly up until the point that the baby arrives. Then you may or may not take leave, parental leave, but the ability to keep the family's head above water financially kind of depends upon both of those incomes. And that means that you make the choice to pay for childcare to get you through that period until you get to the point where the education system kicks in when the child is 6, isn't it? I think 6 years old or thereabouts, and they go into year 1 or they go into reception, maybe a bit younger. And nothing about employment has reflected, or very little about employment in this country more than any others that we're hearing about, is reflecting that changed reality. It's still almost built as if there will always be one parent available to look after a child. And you've just highlighted the bank holiday element of it.
Yeah, the bank holidays. Like I say, if you calculate over a year, I think it's something like we end up basically paying for a whole month for nothing. And my daughter's nursery for 3 days a week is £1,050 per month.
It's a stunning amount of money, isn't it? And it would be,
like I said, you then have both obviously me and my partner both have full-time jobs. I unfortunately don't get given bank holidays off as a given. They get added to my annual leave, but because of the nature of our business, we are open. So if for example, if my partner was in the same situation, we would then have to find an additional childcare for those bank holidays. Luckily, she's able to have the bank holidays off, so she obviously looks after our child. But if it was the case that we were both forced to work on bank holidays,
what would you do?
We would then be paying. Yeah, what would we do? We'd be paying for an additional childcare.
Yeah,
and then there's also this element of both parents work. So my partner works. Well, we both work in the city. I'm a mobile worker, so I go anywhere in the country sometimes, and she's based in the city. If we are late picking up my daughter, there's a fine.
How much is it? How much is it?
So it's £5 per 5 minutes.
Well, I've heard from someone for whom it's £5 a minute.
Yeah, so for us, it's £5 for every 5 minutes you're late. Now, for example, say if my partner,
you don't need to explain. I do want to squeeze in one more call, but I mean, you don't have to explain what that means. But I can't be right, can it? Someone's yanking my chain, saying £5 a minute delay if you're late. I mean, it could be anything. It's completely beyond your control, especially if you're using public transport. Last word on this to Emma in Stockport. Emma, make it quick, but make it good. No pressure.
Okay, very, very quick. To answer your point about how we've got to this position, in terms of the costs keep going up, I think part of the problem we've got is the 15 and 30 hours funding that's provided by the government doesn't actually meet nursery costs.
No.
So they inflate their other costs and pass those costs on to the parents in order to subsidise the free childcare that the government actually provides. So our nursery costs between my 6-year-old leaving nursery and my 2-year-old being at nursery now has gone up £200 a month because they have to keep putting their price up because of national insurance, national minimum wage, energy costs, blah,
energy
blah, blah.
and food as much as anything else at the moment, I think.
So I think that's partly the reason why we're in the situation we're in, is that the government doesn't actually resource the nurseries properly, and therefore the nurseries
I think it'd be a vote winner, wouldn't you? And a relatively straightforward thing to do, just to change the funding model, and then people would be enormously helped.
I'm a Labour Party member, and I would be delighted to see Labour come out strongly on their childcare policy and tell us what they're actually going to do, because nobody talks about it, and I just find it baffling.
Well, you find it baffling as well. I was about to ask you why you think that is, because I don't quite get it. I know I get very boring on the subject of the agenda set by right-wing media, but this wouldn't necessarily... Well, I suppose it involves probably higher taxes in some sense, doesn't it, to pay for it? But that's the sort of thing that you might expect the Labour Party to be addressing or tackling.
Yeah, if you're on a very high income, you don't get the free childcare hours. No. So I suppose there's slight demographic sort of reasons why the Conservatives wouldn't push it. But yeah, I find it very strange.
Well, that's why we shall continue to talk about it until the situation changes. Emma, thank you. You brought me in bang on time as well. It has just gone 12 noon, actually. You didn't bring me in bang on time. That was my bad. Entirely my bad. I don't know what you want to talk about next. There's a couple of things that have caught my eye. There's a wonderful story about police being called to a yoga class that I must share with you, but it's certainly not a phone-in topic. I'm drawn to a tale of blue ticks on YouTube and medical misinformation, which we haven't really talked about much for a while. But I think, not least because of the situation described by the first caller in this hour, I think it's time for one of our irregular returns to the world of working from home. It's changing back again, isn't it? You know how much I love pendulums, swinging pendulums. It swung very far in one direction and everyone was delighted about it. Is it swinging back again?
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 4 minutes after 12. It's the last hour that we'll spend together this week, but don't worry, we're back on Monday. And of course, you can listen to this week's Full Disclosure with one of my favourite authors, Sebastian Faulks. I like the author ones. I don't know how closely you listen to Full Disclosure, but can you tell when I'm a bit... I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, when I'm a little bit a bit too schoolboyish, a bit too eager to please, perhaps is the phrase. I don't know quite what the phrase is, but I sense it in some interviews. Very different vibe going into the studio with an author who I really like. I'm always slightly in awe of authors than there is, for example, with a politician. I don't know. Maybe I want to impress authors. I've got no interest whatsoever in impressing politicians. I do not know, but anyway, just I don't know why I said that, actually. Just sort of interesting, perhaps. Meh. It is 5 minutes after 12. I've just loved this. I love the thing that, I mean, it's not much of a silver lining given the thickness of the cloud, but the way that the pandemic prompted us to reflect upon whether things needed to be the way that they always had been. And I think I got a little bit overexcited about the possibility that it would act as a catalyst for social change. I think the saddest thing that I thought about lockdowns was the fact that the furlough, the existence, never mind the extent of furlough payments, would make people a lot more open-minded about state support for others. So if you took money off the government to keep your head above water during lockdown, then you would become more mellow and less susceptible to right-wing propaganda when it comes to people who need support from the government to keep their head above water when they're not during lockdown. I just thought the notion of welfare, actually, would become detoxified for huge swathes of the population. And unlike me, really, to forget about the effort that the right-wing media puts into making sure that everybody who might need a safety net one day spends their entire life until the moment they need the safety net passionately opposed to safety nets. So that was one little silver lining that I thought might appear as a consequence of the pandemic in particular and the lockdown especially. The other was the nature of work and the idea that the traditional relationship with the workplace was anachronistic. It was technologically defined. You needed to be in an office to do your job because, you know, we didn't have computers at home or phone lines. Or actually, when you think about it, what is the technology that has made working from home possible as opposed to impossible? And part of it is technological, but a lot of it is social. It was just the idea, well, we've always done that. And you know, when you kind of suggest to someone we could do things differently, you see it I sort of in thinking of almost in cartoonish form. Well, but we've always done it like that. Why would we do it differently? People hate change. We generally don't like change. We don't like to be told, even, you know, to sit somewhere else. They come in and rearrange the office. happens quite a lot here. And you say, oh, why have they done that again? I'm just getting used to... I've just found a hiding place for my scissors, and now they've moved it. And now I had a look. We'd quite like a bit of... What is it that we derive from routine? Is it a bit of comfort, security? And so we don't really like change. But sometimes when change happens, we wake up the next morning and we think, oh, this is not... Oh, I think I prefer this to the way it was before. This is lovely. What would you have said 5 years ago if I said to you, do you want to work from home next week? No reason. What would you have said? I don't think you know what you would have said. I think you might have said, not that, no, not that. Or you might have said, yeah, but I can't, can I? It's not really feasible. And then we had to. Then we actually had no choice. Those of us that could work from home were pretty much ordered to work from home. And we started having really interesting conversations about whether this was some sort of catalyst for the swinging of a pendulum, and the pendulum would never swing back. We would now be hybrid workers. We would now almost all spend 2 or 3 days a week in an office if we could, and 2 or 3 days a week at home if we could. And there was a pushback. It was a little bit hard at first to work out where the pushback was coming from. But of course, it was coming from largely vested interests exposed to commercial real estate. So most of the loudest voices that you would have encountered in media and social media railing against lockdowns would have been either sponsored by or indeed part of the constituency that makes money out of commercial real estate, commercial landlords, but not everybody. And also business rates. So there's a political resistance to lockdowns, to working from home in particular, because it reduces the amount of business rates that councils can raise, and that's good for all of us. So there's always a much more, what's the word I'm looking for? Much more nuanced conversation, perhaps, than some of our contemplations allowed. But enough dust has settled now for us to have one of our occasional looks at where the pendulum is now. The productivity question has bottomed out. I think we worked out why quite recently on a very different subject, when the idea of working when you would have been commuting was something that a lot of people did in the early days of lockdown. But obviously, the longer it goes on, the more likely you are to wake up one morning and think, hang on a minute, why am I doing? I could stay in bed. There's a company, well, you're familiar with Lloyd's of London. Workers there have now been told that they should come into the office for at least 3 days a week, and not just Tuesday to Thursday, to ensure that clients are properly served throughout the week. So the head of the world's biggest insurance market is implying that clients don't receive as high a level of service from staff that are working at home as they can expect from staff who are in the office. He has said that he wants to see people working in the building, in the city, for most of the week. And on Mondays and Fridays, when people currently are more likely to be at home, he suggests that clients are not properly covered. They're not being properly looked after. His name is Bruce Carnegie Brown. And he said, we've got to make sure that we still work across the working week and that we don't impede our ability to serve customers by the bookends of the week, defaulting to being a long weekend for everybody every week. So the clear implication, if not accusation, is that if you're doing this sort of Monday and Friday off, then you're taking it a bit easy. You're taking your foot off the pedal on Friday, which is a coincidence, because I came into work this morning, as I always do, via public transport. Thank you, Greta. And I had, for the very first time, I had my kind of, wish I could work from home on Fridays, because it would feel like a bit of an easier gig. It's weird, my job, obviously, but if I had a normal job, I think subconsciously this morning, because of the weather chiefly, and we've bought an enormous sort of glorified paddling pool for the back garden, and it's wonderful. I could be in it. I wonder if I could do the show from it. What would the sound be like, Keith, if I was in a giant paddling pool? Would it be too splashy, do you think? We get the microphone dangling above and I sit back like that, a bit like sort of... Anyway, I genuinely caught myself this morning thinking, because for context, it's really quiet on Fridays. I don't always get a seat on the tube coming into town, but on Fridays, I always do. And usually I always like a seat on the end of a row next to the glass partition. Usually on a Friday, I'll get one of those as well. So Fridays is a great day. Fridays are great days to commute, which means that loads and loads of people are still staying at home. And when we began these conversations, we were supported by statistics that showed productivity was actually going up in many cases with home working. I don't think that's the case anymore. I'm not sure there's evidence that it's gone down, but it's so quiet on Fridays that I genuinely, for the first time today, found myself thinking, oh, that'd be nice. It'd be nice to stay at home today. Which means I'm probably thinking somewhere deep inside that I would not get as much work done as I would do if I was in the office. Not with this job. That's why I said it's subconscious. You're just taking it. You could sit in the garden. Now, I don't know. I don't know if anyone's measured it yet. But on a day like today, you're doing your work on the laptop. You've got Wi-Fi at home. You're probably going to go outside, right? You're probably going to enjoy the weather. And I just want to take a quick look at where we are. I want to take a quick look at what you are doing. So there are two ways into this. The first is obviously the personal one. How much has your life changed since before pandemic? And I want to look at every angle. So we look at the numbers. Well, I go in 1 day a week or I go in 3 days a week. But what other changes has it made to your life? Spending more time with your family, spending more time with your children. The commute's the mad bit, right? The commute is like a liminal space. It's one of my favourite words, liminal. The commute, I know some people get work done, but generally speaking, particularly on the London Underground, you've not got Wi-Fi. And it's hard. You can't really work on a commuter train because you're too busy trying to get your nose out of somebody else's armpit. So this liminal space of commuting is insane. I think that's where my enthusiasm for working from home came from. The realization that 2 or more hours a day are spent in a form of limbo. I know some of us find constructive things to do. You might read a book or you might play games on your phone or watch a film, but it is a limbo. It's a dead space. It's an unconstructive space. So the first thought I had when we started having these conversations was that that's mad. If you can eliminate the commute, then you're giving people 2 hours more time, 2 hours more life to live, real life engagement. Is that still true? Is that still true? What's changed for you? And the second bit of the inquiry this hour is addressing directly the implication, in the words of the boss of the world's biggest insurance market, Lloyd's of London, that have we reached the point now, and I want you to be honest with me, have we reached the point now that you know somewhere deep inside that when you're working from home, you're not putting in quite the same shift as you are when you're in the office? You were at the beginning, but the pendulum has swung. Or not. Or you can call me and tell me that you're doing just as much work as you did at the beginning of lockdown. You're doing just as much work as you did when you went into the office. In fact, you can prove that you're doing more. I'm trying to pin down the relationship between location and output, location and productivity. How much difference does it make? So if you're one of the people doing both, you're one of the people going hybrid, how much difference do you think it makes where you are, whether you're working from home or whether you're working from the office? Because I sense that the narrative is changing now. And the whip is beginning to crack, and that the freedom to work from home on 2 or 3 days a week is just being nibbled away at, and bosses want you back in the office. Is that because of productivity, or is that because you've got to be in the office for bosses to boss you about? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. Be nice, easy conversation this as well. So if you've been waiting for an opportunity to break your duck on the programme, this could be it. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. As I sense a growing mood among employers to get workers back into the office, how do you, as someone who has taken advantage of working from home and continues to take advantage of working from home at least a few days a week, what is the relationship between where you are and what you do? Hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Just one little throwback to the conversation about Elon Musk in the first hour and his apparent warmth, if you like, towards Vladimir Putin's regime, and our confusion about how one billionaire could have ended up in a position to quite substantively influence the course of a war. funny because if Putin wants to, he just helps himself to companies in Russia. He'll just take them back into state ownership, or take them into state ownership at the drop of a hat. And of course, the answer to solving the problem of one man having the power to prolong or foreshorten an actual war, in this case Elon Musk, would be for the American government perhaps to just take Starlink into state ownership. So there's just an irony there that occurred to me as I was reading a couple of your tweets that are still coming in on the subject. There's an irony there that the kind of policy pursued by Putin, which many would regard as totalitarian, never mind authoritarian, is precisely the answer to the problem posed by Elon Musk ending up, perhaps by accident, in a situation to prolong or foreshorten the war in Ukraine. Chris is in Wellingborough. Back to working from home. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I went back to work 2 days a week originally I was off working from home. And then when things got better, they wanted me to go in 2 days a week, which I'm doing and I'm still doing. As far as productivity is concerned, I'm as productive at the office as I am at home.
Yeah.
If anything, I'm better at home because I don't have that environment of aggression or etc. in an office. My figures are higher now than they were beforehand.
What do you mean by what do you mean by aggression? You don't have to tell me. I'm just
office politics and stuff like that. You know, there's people you don't want to sit near. People having conversations that you don't really want to get involved in.
Yeah,
or
distractions, and sometimes perhaps we're not the best version of ourselves in some situations.
Well, definitely not, and I'm a better person for it. And I love going into work. I am.
Yes, me too.
Because I was joining in some of those. I sorted myself out for those. I'm a happier person.
Oh, gosh.
In general, I work from home. I've got my 2 cats here with me.
You just made me think of Finchy from The Office. I don't know why. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. You don't want to get into those sort of situations, and you're going to be a better worker and a happier human when you don't have to.
Exactly. And I'm actually making more money for my company.
Right.
Off a higher turnover, so a slightly lower percentage, but I'm actually making more money for them now than I was.
So it's win-win. It's win-win-win-win-win. Do you think that is there any sense of the employer wanting people to start returning more?
Well, I've thought about that, and I can see it happening, and I can see it happening in many businesses. My issue is that I've now bought a house in Derbyshire, and I will be moving there soon. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my 2 days and stay overnight for those 2 days out of my own costs, so I don't have all the travelling to do twice. If they ask me to do more days than that, I should just leave. I can't do it. I'm at an age now where I want to start kicking back a bit, having a bit of time for myself.
So it's changed your life. I mean, the whole working from home thing has completely changed your life.
I drive 40 miles to work in the morning, and I drive 40 miles home through terrible traffic.
Yeah.
My state of mind is better for that alone, and also my bank balance is because I'm not spending all that money on fuel.
No.
So for me personally, I'm at home, I've got my computer on now, I'm working my what's-its off where I need to. But as in the office, when it's quiet, I can't do anything other than what I do. I work for a company, we import, the company I work for, we're a company that looks after brands but doesn't have its name involved. And I look after a large industrial and marine parts network for the whole of the UK and Ireland. I don't need to be in an office.
No, you really
it's all
don't.
in my head.
No, you really don't.
It's all in my head, and I don't need to go in. And if I go back in again, when I do go in, it's wonderful. I absolutely adore it. I'm smiling. I'm happy. I was never like that before.
Right.
And if I lived where I work, I would be happy to go in every day. But for me, I'm looking for a change in life. I said we bought a house in Derbyshire. We're looking to move there. That's where our life wants to be.
Lovely.
And if I can work 2 days a week,
it's
I'll
a win.
on.
I mean, it'd be interesting, wouldn't it, to see where we think that this push is coming from and why it's coming. Because, and I hope your employer doesn't join. Whereabouts? Is it the Peak District you're moving to, or thereabouts?
No, just South Derbyshire on the Leicestershire border.
Lovely stuff. Lovely stuff.
But I agree what you're saying. I think people think that when you're at home, and people probably are.
Go on. Well, I don't know. You can't say that about other people. I'm not going to let you. But I'm only going to take confessions. I'm not going to take accusations. I will accept calls that say, "Do you know what, James? I'm just having a lolly. If I was in the office, I'd be up again. But I don't know. I think more people are going to be like Chris. But then I'm a very trusting and kind person. Thank you, Chris. Izzy's in Nottingham, which is not far from where Chris is moving to. What would you like to say, Izzy?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah. I would like to say that personally for me, I wouldn't be in the career that I am, and I wouldn't be doing the job that I'm doing if it hadn't been for the switch to working from home in the pandemic.
So another positive life change then from this?
Yeah, 100%.
Tell me more.
I phoned you previously on Mystery Hour because I work in the banking industry.
Yes.
I was essentially, I used to work in a bank branch on a high street.
I remember, yes.
And when the pandemic happened, I moved from the branch into a home-based role in the call centre. And it essentially completely changed my career entirely. I moved into the job that I'm doing now, which is in financial crime prevention. I absolutely love my job. I'm really happy with it. But because of where I live, because I live in the Midlands, I'm very far away from where a lot of kind of the banking hubs and the banking offices are, which means that I pretty much have no choice but to go for fully remote roles unless I want to move, which I don't. So I just think that this decision to kind of move people back into an office it's almost a push away from being able to bring people into your industry with the talent that you might need that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. Because I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for working from home. And I know that the companies that I've worked for have valued the work that I've done, but they wouldn't have been able to take me on if I'd have been going to their office because it just wouldn't be feasible.
Even for a couple of days a week?
The company I work for now, their head office is in Cardiff, and that's 3.5 hours away.
So no.
Yeah.
It's just not an option. Well, it's going to be interesting. Have you picked up on, I mean, it sounds like the company you work for, as with Chris, isn't part of this. And it may be that I'm, reading the wrong newspapers again, because the newspapers are desperate for workers, or were throughout lockdown, desperate for workers to come into the office, because I guess most people probably buy a newspaper on their way to and from work. But do you sense the mood changing and that the warmth with which WFH was greeted is chilling slightly or not?
I do, but I think it depends, like you say, on where you're picking your information up from. So when I first moved to working from home, I used to work for one of the UK's biggest high street banks.
Yes.
And I know that they've since changed their policy to say that a lot of those people are going back into the office at least a couple of days a week. But a lot of sort of smaller banks and like fintech companies and stuff like that are still really happy to work fully remote because they know they get the best out of people.
Well, yes, it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes down, isn't it? Because, there are big perks in it for businesses as well, not least. I remember the very first call we took, or one of the very first calls we took on this, and it was incredibly double-edged. It was from an office manager who was being made redundant because they'd realised quite early on in lockdown that they didn't need an office anymore, that henceforth everybody would be working from home for the duration and not just 2 or 3 days a week. I forget what sector he was in, but yeah, it is almost certainly more nuanced than some of the coverage allows. Thank you, Izzy. Take care. I like this. This is from Paul. He writes, James, your caller Chris says he is busy working from home while not working, but talking to you. And that's from Paul, brackets, working in the office in Sunbury, close brackets. Paul, you've made a terrible mistake. You've got the brackets wrong. What your text should have said was, James, your caller Chris says he is busy working from home while not actually working, but talking to you. Paul, brackets, busy texting James from the office and not working, close brackets. You see? Yeah? See? You little hypocrite. You cheeky little hypocrite. But I do fully accept that you can be working from home and indeed working hard while finding 4 or 5 minutes in your schedule to call the show. It's also probably his lunch break, mate, so give him a break, honestly. It's coming up to 12:30. Let's have the headlines with Tim Humphrey.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:32 is the time. Really interesting calls. And what Chris said about the atmosphere in the office sometimes being detrimental both to your productivity and indeed your sort of mental health almost is a beautiful counterbalance to what the head of Lloyds says about why he wants people back in the office. He says, what we're trying to do now is to make sure that everybody who is an underwriter at Lloyds has at least one box on the ground floor. It should make the ground floor much busier and buzzier as a result. That busyness will encourage a positive cycle of broker and underwriter interaction in the room. That's the intention anyway, so that you kind of have it's literally, when he says a box on the ground floor, that's physical. It's not a figure of speech. He wants representatives from all 85 insurers that are members of the market to be present throughout the week on the main ground floor. They're even refurbishing the underwriting room to make it a more appealing place to work with better technology and more desks. So I don't know how that impacts on the insurance industry, but why would having a buzzy floor somehow improve or enhance business? I don't know, but it's the opposite of what Chris decided, and I can see sense in both. Oh, went a bit BBC there. I can see sense in both sides of the argument, but I truly can. Jill's in Lewisham. Jill, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I'm
Jill.
another nervous first-time caller.
It's only me. Only me.
Okay.
Nothing. Carry on.
So I work in the tech industry, and I was working for near the end of the pandemic. The company I was working for wanted us to come back into the office 2 days a week.
Right.
And I quit because I just didn't want to do it. And it was, I'm working in a job where at the time it was relatively easy for me to find another good job.
Yep.
And so I deliberately took a job with a fully remote company based in San Francisco where there is no office.
Gosh.
So I work with people all over the world and everyone works from home and I just love it.
And had you even contemplated the possibility of home working before COVID arrived?
I did. I did used to work from home occasionally, but
Right.
I also more than an hour getting to the office most days, and I just didn't even think about it. But then when I faced the possibility of having to do that again, I just didn't want to do it.
That's crazy, isn't it? That was the maddest thing about it. Is I remember the morning it happened, and I was sitting here, and I just thought commuting is nuts. It's absolutely nuts, and it's something that the UK seems to have a worse experience of than many, but probably not. Well, definitely not all other countries. But that dead time that we spend in absolute limbo, and getting stressed. And getting stressed, especially if you're driving.
Yeah, and the guy with 2 cats, that made me call in because I got a couple of rescue cats during the pandemic and I want to spend time with them more than I want to spend face-to-face time with my colleagues.
Well, fair enough. I mean, I'd have to meet them to know about the full context of that comment. But what did colleagues think when you made that decision? Do you know? I mean, did you talk to people about, well, that's it, I'm not going back to the office. It means that much to me now. I've discovered this new lease of life, this new mode of living, and it's so good and so good for me that I'm actually going to uproot job entirely as a consequence of being told to go back to the office for a couple of days a week.
Yeah, I know several people who have done the same thing as me, and people who've moved out of London, and so they couldn't go to an office in London even if they wanted to, and have joined other fully remote companies like I have.
Are there loads more now than there were before? Fully remote?
I think there always were. I mean, the company that I work for now was always fully remote, even before the pandemic. Yeah. And companies like that, they've put a lot of effort and thought into how to productively work remotely and work across different time zones. So we just do a really good job of it. And
it's
there's a social aspect to it.
It's the 21st century, isn't it? So the idea of waiting for your colleagues to wake up and stuff like that, there's always going to be someone picking up the baton. I wasn't expecting the phone-in to go this way, actually. This is turning into an absolute ringing endorsement of working from home, with people literally turning down jobs and leaving jobs if they're not able to continue doing so. There's room for every other angle on this as well. Of course there is. Thank you, Jill. Take care. 12:37 is the time. Leah is in Greenwich. Leah, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, I just want to say that I actually echo the sentiments of your callers so far.
Well, this is very boring. Why don't you pretend that you think they're all lazy, work-shy layabouts who wouldn't know a proper day's work if they slapped them around the chops with a wet kipper?
Because I know from my personal experience, I'm working 120% times harder than I was.
Really?
I've never experienced burnout in my career, but I'm starting to experience that now. The expectations for the amount of work that we do has skyrocketed. I'm going from Teams calls to Teams calls to Teams calls without a break.
Right.
I'm able to get into meetings that need to be held urgently. I'm not kind of confined by where I am and having to travel to places to meet people. But that's also come with, and that's helped me in my career. Just like I think one of your callers, Izzy, said, she's been able to move up. I've had 2 promotions, actually 3 promotions since COVID, and it was jobs that I would never have considered because I couldn't physically have maintained going into the office all that time. But what I have to say, and the downside of this is that because we're working in this crazy way, I've found that I can't focus on things anymore. So when you're sitting in a meeting and somebody's talking about something that doesn't relate to your piece of work because you're in a board meeting or something, you just switch off. You're reading emails, you're doing a piece of work whilst you're at that meeting, so you're not really focusing. And now that we're back in the office, I mean, it's been mandated to be back 2 days a week.
Okay.
I'm sitting in physical meetings and then I'm suddenly conscious, oh gosh, I can't actually focus on what
You're
people are
zoning
saying.
out. And you didn't do that before?
No, because you were present.
Pardon?
Because you were present. And
I thought
it was
you said
just,
pregnant then.
No, you were present, but then, you weren't working at
So you've
150 miles
developed
an
distraction almost.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Because I found that I can't focus on being just in that one space without thinking about something else, without trying to type a report, and in between,
Oh, I see what you mean. So you
responding to the
multitask when you're
conversation.
working from home, and that means that there's almost an empty space when you're back in the office, that your brain is thinking, I should be doing something else as well.
Yeah, and now what I've found, James, is actually when I'm in the office, when we're in the office, my colleagues have said the same, is that's the day we don't do much. That's the day it's just a catch up, we're having a chat,
How
I get
interesting.
less done being in the office because there are people around, they'll distract you, they'll say hello and so on. And it's sort of fed that beast in all of us a little bit on wanting to just be alone and not have to interact with people. So I have found that I'm losing my social skills a bit. I'm looking at other jobs at the moment, but I'm certainly looking at that being a perk, so that flexible working arrangement, a maximum of 2 days in the office. I get that a little bit, but I don't buy this whole thing, James, about it's better for our well-being to be in the office. I mean, say it how it is. It's about, it's stimulating the economy. It's about getting people out the house to spend their money on transport, in coffee shops, wherever they eat.
And do you not do that when you're working from home? You don't just spend the money in different places, or do you actually end the month with more still in your bank account than before?
Oh, definitely more still in the bank account, eating healthier, eating more cooked foods, actually not eating at all sometimes. So I've also found a negative of working from home is it's blurred the boundaries for me.
Yes.
When I'm in the office, it's like, right, okay, I've got to be there for 9, so you have that in your head. It's 5 o'clock, I'm leaving, and you can see others leaving, but many a times I've sat at home at 7, 8, 9 in the evening and I still haven't logged off. And I haven't had a lunch break, and that's what I mean about I'm finding myself coming to burnout. It's working harder.
Yes, you need to switch off a bit more. You need to make a deal with yourself that you're going to hit a deadline today and actually clock off at a time. Regardless of what's going on, you need to do that. It's not reciprocated. They wouldn't. Most employers wouldn't go to those sort of lengths for you. You've got to put yourself first, Leah.
Definitely.
So, what would your ideal scenario? What would your ideal scenario be?
I think it's a good balance to have 1 day working from the office. I've seen new colleagues come into my team who found it very difficult to connect to us, and because we've had a relationship before COVID where we know with the team members, we know each other. We've gone out to lunch together. We don't do that anymore.
No.
So you lose that sort of connection. And it's actually, I'm relying on connections that I've built pre-COVID or pre-working from home and this hybrid working model to sort of say, asking a colleague, is it all right? Can you just do me a favour? Can I have this? Or are you able to help me with that? Whereas new colleagues are struggling to build those relationships.
There's a piece today, there's a report today about graduates or undergraduates arriving at university and being in need of almost lessons in social skills.
Yeah.
Because they spent much of their sixth form, of course, in isolation, in forms of isolation, in lockdown, and that fits with what you're describing, doesn't it? That sense of social skills we think of as being something probably as a constant, but they come up and down. And if you were, I don't know if you remember when you first stepped out after lockdown, you felt different. Things were intimidating. The Leicester Square was a weird place where I work. Leah, thank you. That was a lovely call because you covered so much ground and reminded us, of course, perhaps better than anybody else, that this is actually very nuanced and there'll be swings and roundabouts. Won't there? There'll be things that are improving and things that aren't. But the general sense is we're yet to hear anybody really who thinks that working from... Well, I mean, there'll be people listening who hated working from home and who are back in the office, but that experience doesn't negate anything that we've heard. The person who's going to admit that they really take it easy when they're working from home is probably worried that their boss might be listening. Hannah's in Chelmsford. Hannah, what would you like to say?
Hello there, James. I'm
Hello.
a first-time caller, so thank you for having me.
Loads of first-time callers today. How very gratifying.
And I've only been listening to LBC for about the last month, so I'm very new.
You've wasted no time in getting involved, Hannah. That's exactly how it should be. Thank you. What would you like to say?
What I wanted to sort of raise was I actually work in public sector, and I think there's a big, big difference on how to look at this between private sector and public sector.
Almost certainly, but I should add, because I don't think she mentioned it, that Leah worked in the public sector as well, the last caller. So so it does, well, anyway, you crack on.
Yeah, so I actually work in the police, although I'm not operational, obviously for a lot of our staff, nothing changed. My husband works for the NHS. Nothing changed for him during COVID. He was still out and about. It was almost business as usual.
Yes, of course.
I actually really detest working from home.
Why? Why?
I was talking to when I phoned in, I was talking to the lady and I said, I don't have any children. My husband, as I said, was business as usual, out working for the NHS. I ended up having conversations with my cat, albeit one way.
You were just climbing the walls?
Absolutely.
You're a very sociable
100%.
creature, very sociable creature.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So I was itching to get back to work.
Yeah.
And also I had to myself, I've been in the police 20 years, but I had to develop new skills in the sense of learning Teams. I had to present over Teams. I'd never used it before. So that was very, very daunting. I do agree with the previous caller in the sense of when you are on meetings online, you do tend to flick between screens. You're answering emails. You're back in the room with the meeting, this, that and the other. So I've just literally been to a physical meeting. Love it. I love getting out there again. I prefer to go into the office, but what I did say when I phoned in earlier, I can walk to work. I don't have to commute.
Well, that makes
and
a
in
difference.
in a time where people's bills and just the cost of petrol and everything else going on, people have got a lot to outlay. I don't necessarily have that.
Yeah.
So I'm quite fortunate in that respect. But I do, even something as simple as I can only use a laptop at home, whereas in the office I get to use 3 screens, so it makes it easier.
Yeah.
It's more comfortable. There's a lot of different. There's good and bad, but I must admit they're very organisation.
You're all for the office as opposed to working from home. I bet
but
the
it's
cat misses
subjective.
those chats though.
Sorry?
I bet the cat misses those chats.
Well, he's quite old and deaf, so he probably didn't hear half of it anyway. But, it's lovely to get... but I have to say the organisation has been fantastic, being very, very accommodating to people. There are certain things...
Well, I think that, again, is one of the great variables. Some employers are going to balk at the very thought of it, and others are going to be doing the opposite. But I like that. We needed your voice, Hannah. Thank you. As a sparkling debut. I sense you could talk the hind legs off a cat. It's 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 to 1 is the time. I get some lovely messages that tickle me pink but don't always get read out, of course. A dude in my office is a climate change denier, James. Working from home is saving me from losing my mind at idiots, says Mark in the north. You need an idiot's corner, Mark, that's all. Get yourself an idiot's corner, then you put the climate change denier straight into idiot's corner and your mental equilibrium is unaffected. I work for an inconsiderate employer that won't entertain me working from home, James. In fact, he told me I was an idiot for suggesting it, says Chris, who describes himself as a disgruntled truck driver. We probably haven't properly acknowledged the jobs that simply couldn't be done from home. So thank you, Chris, for very amusingly reminding us of that. And some people, very serious points as well. Working from home has allowed me to remain employed. Following significant psychological trauma, I'm unable to leave the house unaccompanied and would not cope in an office environment. If working from home wasn't an option, I'd be on long-term sick leave and would be much more poorly than I currently am as a result. I 12:51, loads going on there. One job you can't really do from anywhere except home, although some writers rent an office, don't they? Some writers, because you like to change your environment, change your space, get out of the house. But I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my favourite authors this week, for full disclosure, Sebastian Faulks, who you are probably familiar with, whether you realise it or not. Birdsong is probably his best known novel, which was televised. Charlotte Gray was made into a big movie, wasn't it? They're part of his French trilogy, which he touches upon here. We cover an awful lot of ground, and the clip is just one taste of one facet of a truly fascinating conversation in which you can hear me fanboying as if there is no tomorrow.
Then I suppose what happened was that as I began to write these books, at the time you don't really understand what your abiding preoccupations are. You go from one book to another. It's only when you look back and you can then see, oh yeah, these all have something in common. What they're all really about is, and I think the first lot of books I wrote, including The Girl at the Lion d'Or, Charlotte Gray, Birdsong, one or two others, were really about trying to orientate myself. We were talking earlier on about my father's generation and grandfather's generation, and I was the child of the Cold War, and I wanted to know, how on earth did we get into this terrible mess? Here we are living in this nice little village in this cosy house, and the world's about to blow itself to pieces in mutually assured destruction. So however many times mum and dad tuck you up in bed and say everything's all right, you think, well, not really. So I think a lot of the earlier books were about how do we, who are we and how do we get here? And one of the things I concluded at the end of it all was that humans are a pretty odd species. And obviously we are super clever and we have achieved things which other creatures will never manage in science and exploration and walking on the moon and understanding the universe. But we are also very violent and we are very fragile, and a lot of us suffer from different kinds of dementia and illusions and delusions. So I think a lot of the next run of books I wrote, including Human Traces, Engelby, Snow Country, and one or two others, are really about not who are we, but what are we? What is the mechanism, and how does it work, and how does it not work?
From the perspective of wanting to understand why we do ridiculous and horrible things.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And wondering whether our abilities to do our superpowers, if you were, come at the cost. And this leads you into genetics, which as a sort of non-scientist is quite a difficult area to go into. But I think that science, particularly biology, it's quite easy to sort of have a saloon bar grasp of it. You can talk about the big ideas and the human genome and this, that, and the other. And as for the sort of, the molecular stuff, if you haven't had a proper training, that's always going to be slightly confusing, the difference between an acid and a protein and a nucleus and a molecule. To us non-scientists, these are all just tiny little things, really.
But not confusing to the point of daunting. I mean, you wanted to tackle this stuff. You want to tackle this stuff.
Yeah, I got very into the idea of the origins of psychiatry and psychology, which I wrote about in Human Traces, and the essential question then in the late 19th century at the time of Freud and ever since really has been, are serious mental illnesses caused by a sort of a genetic or other biological issue? So are they just really versions of multiple sclerosis or versions of Parkinson's disease? Or are they an ordinary person's response to the events of their lives?
Right.
And so that is to oversimplify it a great deal, but it was oversimplified a great deal. And there was a polar opposite of what they called the biological or medical model on one side, and then the psychological model on the other. So I looked into all that, and that led me obviously to look at how we had evolved as a human species, and how you could really explain the fact that we are so much cleverer than we really need to be. I mean, normally in natural selection, in order to survive and prosper, you need to discover a niche in nature that you can inhabit and breed and eat and survive. But in order to outbreed and out-eat our competitors. We didn't really need to have built Salisbury Cathedral or the Sydney Opera House, or indeed have walked on the moon.
Ooh, he's got a beautiful voice as well. I don't think writers should be allowed to have beautiful voices.
He does.
Doesn't he?
Yeah.
I bet you're a Sebastian Faulks fan, aren't you?
I am. Not Any Human Heart, that's William Boyd. Human Traces is one of my favourites of his. I read it cover to cover on a holiday once, and it was just fantastic.
I think the one after that is Snow Country.
I haven't read that.
Oh, because I read that on my last holiday.
Well, I'll do it. I'll take
it?
advantage of that recommendation.
It's beautiful. Same clinic. It's the same sort of but background
you're right,
character.
he has got a gorgeous voice.
Yeah, don't expect that. It's not fair, really, for writers to have beautiful voices. I wonder do you think he records his own audiobooks? Anyway, we should squeeze in one more call. Jake in Woking, can you remember what the topic is this hour, Jake? It's eluded me.
Something to do with working.
That was it. Yeah, what's going on? What's on your mind?
Before the pandemic, I was 5 days a week in the office. Working from home has made a huge difference to personal life.
Yes.
Being here for the kids. I was working in London, living outside of London, so spending my life on the train and my money on the train as well.
Yeah.
So it's a cost saving. There's a huge benefit as well. My wife has been able to flourish at work because I'm now here to do school pickups.
Okay.
So she's developed further in her career, which has been incredible to see as well.
Fantastic.
However, I go 2 days a week in the office now. I do miss working with my colleagues. Instead of a scheduled Teams call or whatever, it's a turn around and a quick chat. And that makes a huge difference. But one thing that's also we're noticing now, so I have a global team reporting to me. 2 of my team members are in London.
Right.
So there isn't always a huge benefit going in because I can see those guys, but most of my calls are remote anyway.
Yeah.
But where we're recruiting now, we're recruiting people that are at the start of their career. They started their career late 2019. So they've only ever known hybrid working and working from home. So where we're trying to bring them into the office, they're quite reluctant because they don't know that setting. They don't know sort of 3-4 days a week in the office.
That's going to be the next phone-in, I suspect, but probably not for a year or so when you actually get the ramifications. Mate, I squeezed you in at the end, Jake. I know you've got more to say, but we have run out of time. That fits with the story that we nearly talked about today about universities having to teach COVID students how to socialise. So you're talking about the next cohort up from that arriving, having spent much of their university or college time in lockdown. That's it from me for another day. You can, of course, if you missed any of today's shows, listen back on the catch-up on Global Player, where you can also rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcasts. Rewind live radio on Global Player. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick, but now Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.